What if the very legacy that turned André Rieu into a legend is the very thing that makes his family weep? He conquered the world's most magnificent halls with waltzes so devastating they brought strangers to tears. His bow commanded memory, dragged buried emotion into the light, and forced classical music to breathe again. Night after night, applause erupted without mercy. And night after night, it ended the same way, one man stepping away from the stage, leaving pieces of himself behind. Every smile was immaculate. What followed was erased, exhaustion unseen, words that never reached home, moments lost between the curtain and the door. The triumph was absolute. So was what quietly disappeared with it. They crowned him the King of Waltz, but crowns do not rest. They sink, relentlessly, into the body beneath them. The world looks at what he built and struggles to grasp its scale. $600 million. Not resting, but in constant motion, sustaining a universe that never sleeps. A 15th century castle, rebuilt stone by stone, not as a monument, but as a living stronghold of music and refuge. Violins worth millions, carried like breathing organs whose voices hold entire orchestras together. 110 lives moving forward only as long as he stayed upright. More than 80 properties across Europe, not for indulgence, but to keep a traveling empire from collapsing inward. Vehicles engineered to move sound itself across borders, absorbing the moments he lowered his head backstage, emptied beyond applause. Even when the stages went dark, nothing stopped. If his melodies ever carried you through sorrow, leave a tribute below and honor him with a like. Some hearts are born with fractures too wide for childhood to mend, and for some, survival becomes the first form of wealth. André Léon Marie Nicolas Rieu was born on October 1st, 1949, in Maastricht, a quiet Dutch city still tasting the bitterness of war, where cobblestones remembered marching boots and church bells rang, as if hoping to soften ghosts that refused to leave. His family was respected, secure, never poor, yet the air inside their home felt rationed, measured, disciplined, and starved of warmth. His father, André Rieu Sr., a revered conductor, could summon thunder from an orchestra, but never a single word of tenderness for his son. His mother, Katharina, ruled the household with precision and silence, running it like a flawless score with no rests to breathe. Everything functioned perfectly, except the human heart. Years later, André would recall it without bitterness, only precision. People think it was a feeling. It wasn't. I understood it. One of 6 children, he learned early how to disappear politely. Meals eaten quietly, chairs pushed in neatly, hands never reaching for comfort. As a boy, he sat alone, tracing his father's conducting with a pencil, not dreaming of applause, only of being seen. It never came. When he finally confessed that he wanted to make music filled with joy, not severity, his father dismissed him with a glance so brief it cut clean. In that world, joy was indulgence. Passion was unprofessional. I learned very young, André would later say, that approval can be loud, but it is never warm. That knowledge did not fade. It settled, and it stayed. At 6, he reached for a violin almost too large for his small hands, and something irreversible began. The bow trembled not with fear, but with hunger, for sound, for warmth, for proof that something could answer back. Some nights, his fingers burned from the cold, yet he played on, because pain was the only sensation that confirmed he was still there. After dinner, when the house fell into its nightly stillness and his father's footsteps faded down the corridor, André played into the dark, a child asking wood and strings for what people never offered. It wasn't discipline, it wasn't ambition, it was survival. The violin didn't turn away, he would later reflect. It stayed when everything else went quiet. Even now, he remembers the scent of resin and candlelight, the vibration against his ribs like a borrowed heartbeat. Fragile, insistent. Long before fame, he learned that a body can remain upright while the heart learns how to endure alone, a lesson that would echo decades later as exhaustion and imbalance followed him through life. Warmth did not wait for him beyond those walls. When André entered the Royal Conservatory of Brussels in the late 1960s, he stepped into halls heavy with ambition and varnish, where technique was worshipped and emotion politely discouraged. Precision was praised. Feeling was treated as excess. André did not fail. He unsettled. He played with too much heart, and for that, he paid in silence. Those years left marks no one could see, he later said, but they taught me how to stand when standing hurt. He dreamed of an orchestra that could smile, sway, and make people feel less alone. When he shared that vision, peers laughed. Professors urged him to grow up, to abandon fantasies of happiness. He listened, but he did not yield. By the mid-1970s, conviction hardened beneath his gentleness. At 29 in 1978, with no family blessing, no financial safety net, and only a handful of believers beside him, he formed the Maastricht Salon Orchestra. The rehearsal space was modest, the halls drafty, the future dangerously uncertain, but the laughter was real. And for the first time, real was enough. Beside him stood Marjorie, the one presence whose belief never retreated. Their love met resistance so fierce that his mother's refusal to accept their marriage severed the final thread binding him to his past. The loss was permanent. It felt like something was torn away, André would later admit, but inside that tearing, I learned how to move freely. From that wound grew independence. He was no longer a son waiting for approval. He became an artist, building a world where warmth could finally exist. Years later, when asked if he forgave his parents, he paused, then answered quietly, "I don't know if forgiveness fits. I learned how to keep playing through the silence." Those early concerts, tiny halls, town squares, audiences close enough to hear his breath, became his truest expression. He wasn't performing, he was exchanging something human. Each note was a quiet refusal to let coldness win. "I wasn't raised in warmth," he once reflected, "so I chose to create it." From that choice, André Rieu began to reshape what classical music could offer. Not perfection without feeling, but connection earned through endurance. And from a childhood built on restraint and silence, a life began to rise, one the world would admire, long before it understood how much standing upright, without support, had required. By 1987, after years of rejection, exhaustion, and a doubt he learned to carry quietly, André Rieu stood before the most dangerous decision of his life. At 38, an age when many men begin to guard what they have, he chose exposure over safety, risk over preservation. The same hands that once shook in childhood silence now held a dream thin as glass and heavy as iron, capable of breaking him or remaking everything. With 12 musicians, nothing more, he formed the Johann Strauss Orchestra. The classical elite laughed. They called it reckless, sentimental, naive. They thought I had lost my sense, André would later reflect. But I'd rather lose myself to joy than survive inside perfection. He wasn't courting approval. He was trying to free music from marble, to make it breathe, smile, and reach those who had learned to sit quietly outside its doors. What followed burned away every illusion. Money arrived like hesitant applause. Too late, too little, never enough to pause. Every concert was a wager. Every tour a test of whether belief could outlast arithmetic. He sold what he owned, borrowed what he could, repaid, and began again, feeding the orchestra before himself. There were nights he played on stages so cold his fingers numbed mid-phrase, nights he skipped meals so his musicians wouldn't. His body protested, dizziness, shaking hands, a relentless ringing, born of endless rehearsal, but stopping was not an option. There were evenings, he remembered, when the lights swam and the floor felt untrustworthy. I stood because the music asked me to. On January 1st, 1988, 12 musicians stepped onto the stage with a hope barely holding together. The music rose, the hall erupted, and backstage, when the lights fell, André sat trembling, hands aching, heart racing, while the ledgers still bled red. In that silence, he learned a truth applause never teaches. Admiration cannot carry a dream. Some months, survival narrowed to numbers and nerve. Instruments failed. Travel costs climbed. People depended on him waking up steady tomorrow. After shows, he walked alone through frozen streets, coat pulled tight, whispering, "Just one more concert, just one more miracle." In small hotel rooms, he counted coins by lamplight until dawn, his reflection hollow in the glass. Exhaustion blurred his sight mid-performance, yet his bow never fell. It shook, but it held. "If I ever collapse," he once told himself, "let it be on stage, inside the music." Decades later, he would remember those years without bitterness. "I don't recall the debts," he said softly. "I remember faces, the smiles that told me standing was worth it." City by city, doubt loosened its grip. Laughter answered back. He didn't know then that the imbalance threatening his body had already begun. Still, he played. Because to André, joy was never the absence of pain. It was what remained upright after pain had taken its share. His body might falter. His music never learned how to kneel. By the mid-1990s, André Rieu's relentless drive finally surfaced, but nothing about it resembled the effortless glow later labeled global fame. What the world would soon applaud had been carved from years of sleepless nights, personal debt, and the quiet strain of one man carrying too many futures on a single pair of shoulders. In 1995, a single performance altered his trajectory forever. Shostakovich's Waltz No. 2 at a UEFA Champions League match. Tens of thousands froze in stunned silence before the stadium erupted, applause rolling like a shockwave. In that instant, his music leapt across borders. Yet behind the history-making night were weeks without rest, hotel desks buried under spreadsheets, and a fear he rarely voiced, that the orchestra might collapse under the very momentum lifting it. "That evening opened the world to me," André later recalled, but it also began the harder task, keeping the flame alive without letting it burn everything else. From then on, life became relentless motion. Airports bled into rehearsals, rehearsals into stages, no pause between continents. Waltzes filled plazas in Europe, then arenas across America, Asia, and Australia, selling out tens of thousands of seats night after night. What audiences saw was splendor. What followed him was weight. André was no longer only the artist. He became producer, financier, and guardian to more than 100 livelihoods. Payrolls, transport, insurance, promotion, decisions measured in millions, pressed against the same body that stepped on stage smiling each evening. Annual revenues climbed into the tens of millions. Millions of tickets were sold. Recordings moved in the millions worldwide. Yet the title, King of Waltz, was never a crown he wore. It was a responsibility that settled inside him and stayed. Some nights, exhaustion blurred his vision, notes drifting like ghosts beneath the lights. Still, he played. There were evenings, he admitted, when I bowed and barely felt my arms, but the people in front of me kept me upright. By the early 2000s, he had built what few musicians ever dared, a fully independent musical empire. Studios, promotion, logistics, everything answered to him. He built his own recording studio in Maastricht to protect the sound that carried his name. Each expansion was a gamble measured in millions. Some soared, others nearly ended everything. In 2009, cancellations and physical collapse triggered losses exceeding $15 million in a matter of months. Sleep disappeared. Calculation replaced rest. I wasn't counting profit, he later said. I was counting how to keep everyone standing. The assets told the truth of that choice. Dozens of properties, over 30 in Maastricht alone, used to house staff, store instruments, and shield the orchestra's fragile machinery. Convoys of trucks carried priceless violins and sets across borders. Chefs cooked to keep musicians strong. A nursery traveled with the tours so families could endure the road. None of it was indulgence. It was protection. "My orchestra is my family," André once said quietly. "You don't walk away from family." To the public, there were chandeliers, gowns, and summer skies. Behind the curtain, endless rehearsals, a body negotiating its limits, and ledgers heavy with risk. By the time André Rieu commanded the world stage, his fortune was vast, hundreds of millions in value, more than 80 properties, one of the most profitable independent music enterprises in history. Yet when he spoke of success, his pride rested elsewhere. "People see the beauty," he said softly. "They don't always see what it takes to keep it standing. I'm proud of both." His body has weakened with time. His music has not. Every waltz still carries the echo of that truth. That admiration is sustained not by brilliance alone, but by endurance that never learned how to bow. Among everything André Rieu built, nothing carried the same pulse of life, memory, and exposure as his castle and his two Stradivarius violins. To the world, they gleam like trophies of success. To him, they are mirrors of the body and spirit that carried music through decades of fatigue, collapse, and return. The 15th century castle in Maastricht was never about grandeur. Long before chandeliers and global tours, it was the place where a fragile boy once touched a piano and felt sound steady a shaking heart. When he finally bought it in 1999, after years of relentless touring, mounting strain, and a body worn thin, it was not pride that led him there, but survival. "I needed somewhere," he later reflected, "where my heart could slow when the world refused to." Restoring the castle became a form of quiet surgery. Brick by brick, corridor by corridor, he rebuilt more than walls. Each window reopened to light, each garden coaxed back to life, seemed to murmur a single truth: "You are still here." The castle became a living body, the glass conservatory warming him after endless cold hotel rooms. The tropical garden, giving breath when flights and rehearsals left his lungs heavy. Within those walls, he built a recording studio, not to expand an empire, but to shelter what remained of himself. On days when balance failed and strength thinned, he returned there, violin in hand, letting sound move through him like medicine. Silence, he once said, can mend you or cut you. You learn which one you're standing in. When his body faltered, the castle kept time for him. Just as sacred were his two Stradivarius violins, one born in 1667, the other in 1732, wood-shaped by centuries, voices carrying the weight of history. To André, they were never mere instruments. They were breath and pulse made audible. "When I hold them," he said quietly, "it feels as if time is breathing back." Yet even these irreplaceable companions were drawn into the hardest season. During the long silence of the 2020 pandemic, when concerts vanished and income dropped to nothing, responsibility did not pause. Salaries still needed paying. Families still waited. The orchestra, his family, still depended on him standing. Alone with his ledgers and the stillness, André found himself facing the unthinkable, selling one of the Stradivarius violins to keep everyone afloat. The thought hollowed him. It felt, he later admitted, like preparing to give away a piece of my own body. He never did. Somehow, the music endured, even when the world was quiet. To outsiders, the castle and violins signal wealth. To André Rieu, they testify to endurance, to knowing when to rest and when to rise, to a soul that refused to collapse when silence pressed hardest. The castle is where music still breathes when his lungs weaken. The violins, where his heart continues to sing when his hands begin to tremble. Together, they form his anatomy, stone and wood, carrying what flesh alone could not. And when asked what they truly mean, he only smiles and says, "They remind me that even the finest instruments, like the human heart, must be tuned again and again if they are to keep singing." The year 2020 pushed André Rieu into a silence no stage, no rehearsal, no lifetime of ovations could ever have trained him for. For decades, his existence had obeyed a sacred tempo: rehearse, travel, perform, repeat. A rhythm so relentless, it felt indestructible. His pulse had learned to synchronize with orchestras and crowds. Then, without warning, the world went mute. The pandemic cut through sound like a clean blade. Tours evaporated, borders sealed shut. Halls that had breathed with his music for half a century fell dark in unison. The man whose violin once commanded cathedrals and stadiums now stood in rooms that answered him with nothing. The applause that had carried him through exhaustion and solitude was replaced by a stillness that did not wait between notes. It lingered. It wasn't rest, he would later say, almost to himself. It felt like the air had stepped back. For the first time, silence was not a pause, it was a presence. His fear, however, never centered on himself. It circled the more than 100 lives bound to his standing. Musicians, technicians, drivers, tailors, families whose stability moved in rhythm with his bow. As tours collapsed and revenue fell to zero, André turned inward to the reserves he had spent decades building, not to protect legacy, but to keep people afloat. Month after month, while the world remained frozen, his accounts thinned. At night, spreadsheets glowed back at him, red figures blurring under tired eyes. One by one, quiet sacrifices followed. An old vintage car let go, a long-held investment released, pieces of personal history exchanged for time. And when the silence pressed harder still, he found himself standing before his most intimate companion, the 1732 Stradivarius. For decades, it had breathed beside him through triumph and collapse alike. To imagine parting with it felt unbearable, and yet he stood there and allowed the thought to exist. "If this is what keeps them standing," he whispered, barely audible, then I have to be ready. He never sold it, but the fact that he could stand at that edge told the truth no balance sheet ever could. This was not about money. It was about how much of oneself can be offered without vanishing. Inside his castle, once alive with sound and movement, the quiet deepened. The recording studio lay untouched. Violins slept in their cases. Corridors that had once carried laughter now carried memory alone. He walked them slowly, tracing the outlines of a life built note by note, hearing echoes where melodies used to live. Outside, the world trembled with fear. Inside, André Rieu faced a more intimate fragility, not as an icon, but as a man whose entire way of being had always moved forward through sound. When you are forced to stop, he later reflected softly, you finally understand what music truly is. Every note becomes a gift. Every silence teaches you something. In that stillness, he began to compose again. Music slower, deeper, stripped of spectacle. These were no longer performances, they were prayers. When the world finally reopened and he stepped back onto a stage after more than a year, the applause that rose was not thunder, it was tenderness. 1,000 hearts exhaled together. Some wept openly, recognizing their own losses in his eyes. That night, the waltzes carried the echo of long restraint. Crescendos softened, smiles trembled, every bow stroke whispered survival. What stood beneath the lights was no longer only the King of Waltz, but a man who had walked through fear, isolation, and the quiet collapse of everything familiar, and learned that even when music falls silent, it does not disappear. It waits, and so does the human spirit. The cruelest silence a musician can ever face does not come from an empty hall. It rises from inside his own body. By 2010, after decades of sleepless flights and tours that blurred into a single, endless road, André Rieu met an enemy no ovation could silence. A sudden virus crept into his inner ear, stealing balance without warning, turning solid ground into a shifting sea. The man who had commanded orchestras across continents now fought to command his own limbs. Concerts prepared months in advance fell away one by one. Letters arrived from around the world. Prayers folded between pages, hope pressed thin like dried flowers. Yet behind closed doors, the King of Waltz became a trembling figure, fingers grazing the wall just to remain upright. Vertigo, nausea, disorientation, days dissolved into spinning rooms and stubborn breath. For a man shaped by motion, forced stillness was not rest, it was punishment. Nights stretched without mercy. He paced dark corridors, violin in hand, whispering words meant for no one. I have to return. They're waiting. Each step echoed like a metronome, counting time against despair. In those hours, he learned what applause never teaches, that healing is not a miracle, but a discipline, measured one unsteady breath at a time. Balance returned, and grief arrived in its place. In 2016, just as his body began to trust the ground again, fate struck from another direction. Ruud Merckx, his closest friend, his trombonist, his constant, collapsed mid-tour. One day, laughter filled their dressing room. The next, an absence no music could disguise. André stepped onto the stage that night, as always, but the lights felt harsher. The applause thinner, the music heavier. Every note carried weight, every waltz bent toward mourning. It felt, he would later say quietly, like losing a part of myself I didn't know how to live without. From that night on, he left a single bar of silence in his performances, never announced, never explained, always for Ruud. In that fragile pause, Grief was allowed to breathe. Pain became ritual. Loss set the tempo. Love learned how to endure without answers. By 2024, the body issued its clearest warning yet. In Mexico, beneath a merciless sun, 40,000 people waited beyond the curtain. He raised his bow, and the world fractured. Light burst. Sound collapsed into a hollow ring. The stage surged upward. Voices blurred as paramedics flooded the wings, flashlights cutting through the gold haze. The warmth of performance drained into sterile white as they lifted him onto a stretcher. Breath thinned. The world narrowed to heart monitors and Marjorie's shaking voice beside him. "I don't ever want another opening night like this," he murmured, eyes unfocused beneath the glare. That night, alone in a dark hotel room, silence pressed against his chest, like weight. Messages blinked unanswered on his phone. Fans, friends, family. He stared at the ceiling, counting the slow rhythm of his pulse, wondering if the curtain had already fallen. Dawn came without ceremony, and when it did, he chose, again, to rise. Recovery was ruthless. Doctors warned him that each year, the body heals more slowly. Still, he fought back inch by inch, teaching his hands to steady, his legs to trust the floor, his will to outlast the spinning world. Some days he practiced only minutes before dizziness returned. Others, he pushed through tears to finish a single phrase. Each performance became a negotiation with pain. Every bow, stroke, a quiet duel with time. Before stepping on stage, he glanced toward the empty space where Rude once stood and whispered, "Stay close, old friend." Tours shortened, rehearsals softened, but the fire did not dim. He learned to measure success not in ticket sales, but in breath. The simple miracle of being able to play. His waltzes grew slower, gentler, unmistakably human, not in surrender, but in defiance. Each note pulsed like a heartbeat reclaimed. Each applause felt like oxygen, returning to tired lungs. And standing once more beneath the lights, hands trembling, yet holding firm, André Rieu understood at last. The greatest music he would ever make was not born of strings or fame, but of survival, chosen again and again. For more than half a century, Marjorie has been the quiet force holding André Rieu's world together, not in the spotlight, but just behind it, where the real weight lives. While the world saw chandeliers, swirling gowns, and waltzes glowing under golden light, she was the one counting heartbeats when exhaustion crept too close. Every tour route, every contract, every fragile shift in his health passed through her hands first. She managed schedules the way others manage lifelines, negotiated multi-million-dollar deals and long-term touring agreements with the calm of someone protecting far more than a business, and balanced ledgers long after midnight so an empire valued at an estimated $600 million could keep breathing. That number was never static. It moved constantly, through concert revenues that filled stadiums, album sales counted in the tens of millions, licensing rights across continents, and a fully private production infrastructure that allowed Rieu to remain fiercely independent of major labels. During peak touring years, that independence came with a cost few ever see. Monthly fixed expenses climbing into the millions, even when no music was playing. Staff salaries, insurance, storage, transport, and the safeguarding of instruments whose value could not be replaced. Through debt cycles, financial storms, sleepless flights, and the long, unnerving silence of the pandemic, when money went out faster than it came in, Marjorie never flinched. André once said, almost to himself, "Music saved my soul, but Marjorie saved my life." Their son, Pierre, grew up not in front rows, but backstage, falling asleep to the low hum of rehearsals, waking before sunrise to the smell of rosin, diesel, and coffee brewed beside loading docks. He learned early that greatness is not spectacle, it is responsibility carried when no one is watching. Today, Pierre stands guard over every detail of his father's life and business. Tour pacing, production scale, recovery windows, even the deliberate choice to stop when stopping becomes necessary. He oversees an operation that spans more than 80 properties across Europe, over 30 concentrated in Maastricht, along with fleets of custom-built touring vehicles, Mercedes sleeper buses refitted for medical access, reinforced trucks engineered to carry priceless violins, chandeliers, lighting rigs, and wardrobes across borders at night, while André sleeps inside, earplugs in, body braced against motion. Pierre has seen what applause never sees. The tremor in André's bow hand after 2 hours under stage lights, the silence that follows when the curtain falls and adrenaline drains away. When the clapping stops, Pierre once said quietly, "That's when my real work begins, making sure my father can stand again tomorrow." And then there is Daisy, André's granddaughter, her small fingers wandering across piano keys with the same wonder that once lived in his own childhood hands. Her laughter now fills halls, once shaped by discipline and restraint. She is living proof of the family's unspoken promise. Music is never forced. It arrives when it's ready. Watching her play, André once whispered, "It feels like the music has found a new body to breathe in." Now, in January 2026, André Rieu lives close to his beloved 15th century castle, in a quieter home that has become something rarer than luxury, a refuge. Together, the castle and surrounding residences form part of a carefully structured real estate portfolio, estimated well above $200 million, historic landmarks restored stone by stone, modern homes adapted for privacy and medical access, and operational buildings used for rehearsals, archives, costume storage, logistics, and recording. The castle itself, acquired and restored over years at enormous personal cost, functions as both symbol and backbone, housing studios and standing as a cultural anchor for his musical universe. His personal home, by contrast, has been reshaped around preservation rather than expansion. His days now move with disciplined restraint. Morning walks through mist-covered gardens, balance and strength training guided gently by his coach, herbal teas replacing champagne, meals calculated not for pleasure but for longevity by doctors and chefs who understand how much his body has already given. Time has left its signature: slower steps, smaller movements, posture shaped by caution rather than conquest. Yet his presence remains unmistakable. Some afternoons, he plays for hours in his studio. Others, he simply holds the violin, as if listening instead of speaking. Evenings belong to Marjorie, Pierre, and Daisy. Shared dinners, unguarded laughter, the relief of being loved without performance. Though he has never publicly detailed a will, the family already understands the architecture of what will endure. Assets carefully allocated, management responsibilities transferred, touring intensity reduced, decisions no longer driven by growth but by protection. Quietly, without press releases, significant sums have also been directed toward music education, local cultural foundations, and musicians' welfare, not as charity for recognition, but as a way of keeping the ecosystem alive that once carried him. The echoes of his July 2025 Maastricht concerts still linger like breath in the air. Nights of gratitude rather than conquest, events that generated millions in revenue yet were deliberately scaled to protect health, rather than chase excess. Under the summer sky, thousands stood together as the final notes drifted upward, many in tears, sensing they were witnessing something fragile and unrepeatable. Backstage, André whispered, "I'm still here, and so is the music." Now, he plays fewer notes, but each one carries the full weight of a life lived forward despite resistance. His health is no longer an enemy, it has become a teacher. Every breath, every lifted bow is a quiet refusal to disappear. He knows the curtain will fall someday, but not yet, not while his heart still moves in waltz time. Because André Rieu's true legacy has never been applause, awards, or even a fortune measured in numbers. It is the unseen lives he lifted, the widower who smiled again, the lonely who felt less alone, the aging who found courage to keep dancing. His story reminds us that the truest music is not what reaches our ears, but what steadies us inside, the resolve to keep breathing, to keep loving, to keep believing in beauty even when the years grow heavy. If his melodies have ever carried you through grief or led you back to joy, leave your tribute below. Even a single word becomes part of his enduring symphony. And as you listen tonight, remember this: no matter how tired your heart feels, there is still music left in you. May you live your own waltz, in health, in peace, and in the quiet wealth of a life deeply loved.